Alrighty, so good morning, let's get started. Okay, so we're up to Sifvav, and up until now, we've been learning about the restriction to disallow a person from just borrowing something that doesn't belong to him based upon his desire to use it. You're not allowed to borrow something without the owner's knowledge of it and without the owner's permission. That's the general category. And we did learn that there were certain exceptions. If you go, sometimes you can go according to the majority, that if it's a type of item that most people are more than happy for other people to utilize, so then you're allowed to borrow it. But if you know that the person is makbid, the person doesn't want you to borrow it, let's say he wrote something, let's say in a book, saying, please don't read. So then even though other people might not mind, like in today's world where books are ubiquitous, they're affordable and they're durable, unlike, let's say, what was existent in the earlier periods of history. So then, but if he writes in the book, most people wouldn't mind, but he writes in the book, Asr B'li Rishus, right, which is what's very common in yeshivas. You got to ask permission before you read this book. So then you should stay away. Okay. Umikol makom. He says, all of that notwithstanding, im ira la'adam eza hefsed pitom. If a person is about to incur some kind of sudden loss, okay, something's happening where if he does nothing, then some kind of huge financial loss will take place. But if he does intervene, he's going to have to use something that belongs to his friend. Rashai litol chafatzav shel chavero shelo midaito lahatzil bahem shelo u'lishalem lechavero ma'ish yikalkel v'yafsid chafatzav. It is permissible to take something that doesn't belong to me, even without the person's consent or knowledge, and use it to save the huge financial loss that I'm about to incur, as long as I pay him afterwards. So even though normally it's usher, I'm considered to be a gazlan by borrowing something that doesn't belong to me. But if, let's say, there's a flash flood and I have to, the only way that I can save, or let's say there's a huge leak and the only way that I can save it is if there's a certain tool that my neighbor has that I don't have. And if I don't do it now, it's going to destroy a significant piece of property, a valuable piece of property. I'm allowed to borrow that item such that even if I end up damaging it or breaking it, I'll have to pay him for it. But Chazal did permit a person to save his property with someone else's property, as long as he's prepared to pay for it. Va'afilu im yafsidim legamre. Even if that means completely destroying my friend's property in the process of saving my more valuable property. Kagon, shenishbur lo chavis devash, v'yesh lechavero chavis malaya yayin. So the classic example that's brought in the Gemara is the following case. I have an earthenware jug of honey, and honey is considered to be a more expensive commodity than wine, okay? At least in the times of the Gemara. Is that true today? Possibly, depends on the wine, it depends on the honey, yeah? So my earthenware jug of honey cracks, and the honey is about to completely spill out. I see my friend's earthenware jug of wine or flask of wine. Rashai lishpoch yeno shel chavero la'aretz lahatzil b'chavito hadvash. He says, I am allowed to, without even asking, grab my friend's container of wine, spill out the wine, so that I can save the honey. That's the case the Gemara brings. Shedamav yikarim min hayayin, because the honey is more valuable. U'lishalem lechavero demeyeno, and I can just compensate to my friend the value of his wine. Okay, so a bottle of wine, let's say, or an earthenware container of wine is $10. but this honey is maybe $20. So I'll owe my friend $10, but at least I'll have saved $10 on my honey. No, there's an objective value on the market for that commodity, right? So sentimental value is, we did see that there, I think we did see an example of something that has sentimental value before, but this is a commodity.
Not like today where you have beautiful bottles and things like that, that give that extra push of sort of way of the wine. Before it was just a barrel of wine.
So the classic example is a commodity. Now, obviously, there could be things which, yeah, could have sentimental value, but I don't know that a person would be able to make that argument in a based in. Things do have objective value. You take my dad's ashes from his cremation because you need to save something in his jug. Yeah. Right. Even though I'm just thinking that would be a funny example of spill them out. Okay. V'im chavero kan chayiv chavero la'asos kain k'shezeh mevakesh mimenu. And we'll go even further in the halacha. If the owner of the container of wine is present, he's obligated to volunteer to spill out the wine. And he's obligated to comply with the request of the guy who says, please, do you mind if you spill out your wine? I really need to save my honey. I think I misspoke. It's not that he's obligated to volunteer. He's obligated to comply with the request. In other words, if the owner of the honey asks me, would you mind spilling out your wine because I need to save my honey, I have to say, go right ahead. V'zehu tanai mitanoim shehisna Yehoshua im Yisrael keshehinchi lahem es haaretz. As the Gemara says, this is one of the conditions that Yehoshua ben Nun made with the Jewish people when he gave them property. Now, why from Yehoshua ben Nun? Because this is the first time that the Jews were real property owners. And he said to them, as property owners, you have certain civic duties to surrender your property under certain conditions. And, when there's public works for the greater good, right? That's sort of like the idea, is that this was the first time Jews became communal property owners or property owners within a community. And Yehoshua made them promise that they would comply with certain basic civic laws. V'yesh cholkim bazeh. But there are people who disagree with this halacha and who hold that I don't have a right to go destroy my friend's property to save my own. The Yirei Shamayim yachmir la'atzmo b'davar she'ein bo hefsid. He says, and a God-fearing Jew should be machmir with something that does not involve loss. Now, what does that mean with something that doesn't involve loss? I thought the whole time we were talking about something that does involve loss. So the Imrei Yaakov explains, wrote Salomar, the Yirei Shamayim yachush lisvara rishona v'yishboch yeno kedei lahatzil dibsho shel chavero b'makom she'en lo hefsid sheyodea shechavero yishalim lo avor yeno. He says, in other words, is the owner of the wine obligated to spill out his wine? This is the question. If the owner of the wine is present, is he obligated to comply? So some people say that if he's present, he's not obligated. But a God-fearing person should be machmir and to spill out his wine to save his friend's honey when he knows he's not going to incur a loss. Because why? Because he knows that the owner of the honey will pay him for the wine. In other words, that's the machlokas. There's not a machlokas as to whether when the owner is not present, I'm allowed to spill out his wine. The question is, what's the obligation of the wine owner when he is present? So the first opinion is the wine owner is obligated to comply with the request of the honey owner. And the second opinion is that if the wine owner is present, he's not obligated. He can say, sorry, buddy, you've got a loss. It's not my problem. And I'm continuing walking down the street with my wine. But a God-fearing Jew should be machmir, like the first opinion, but only when he knows that the honey owner will compensate him for his wine, so he will not incur a loss. Okay. Umikol makom. And then he writes in the parentheses that all of this, despite all that we've just written, that if I know that I'm about to incur a loss, I'm allowed to save my loss by taking my friend's property. Im iralo hefsid pitom lo yatzil shelo bekilkol chafatzav shel chavero shelo midaito. You should not save your own property by destroying the property of your friend. Afal pisha mishalim lo. Im bal nefesh ulachush lisvara ha'achrona. If he's a God-fearing person, and you are worried about the second opinion that says that the guy, if the wine owner was present, he would be allowed to refuse. And if you're going to worry about, if you're going to be concerned about that opinion, then you should also not destroy your friend's property when he's not present. Because according to the second opinion, he would have rights of refusal. Unless you know the guy and you're certain that he's not going to mind as long as you make him good. So like Moshe, in your suggestion about what about, sentimental value, what about, I'll go even further, I'll expand the example. What about that that this guy, not so much that he has a sentimental attachment to that particular bottle of wine, but that he's the type of person that is just is very uptight. He's an uptight kind of guy in general. And he doesn't like people touching his property. There are certain people like that, even though, you're willing to pay him for it, he just gets uptight, And so if you're concerned that about the second opinion that we just learned about, that the wine owner does have rights of refusal when he's present, then you should also not touch his stuff, even to save your own property, even though you have a right to do so, right, based on the takana that Yehoshua made. But nonetheless, a person who wishes to be extra careful will avoid this situation, unless the guy is not an uptight person. He's an easygoing fellow, and he's likely not to mind. He'll understand the predicament that you were in, and he'll accept payment for any damage that you caused to his property. If my friend has a tool, for example, that I need to borrow in order to save myself from significant loss, he's not home, but I know that it's in his garage, and I explained to him afterwards I needed, because I sprang a leak, and I didn't have the monkey wrench to fix it, but I know that you have a monkey wrench, and I just needed to borrow it temporarily. So then, if the guy's, if the guy will be understanding, fine. In that situation, since you're not damaging his property, you're just using it, you're borrowing his tool, so you don't even have to worry about the second opinion at all. Second opinion is only a concern when there's going to be financial loss involved to your friend by taking his property. Okay, so let's take a look now at the full commentary of the Imrei Yaakov. What does he say? Chayav chavero la'asot kain. Your friend is obligated to surrender his property in order to help you save your more valuable property. Demutal alav l'kaya mitzvahs hashavas avedas mamon chavero kaven shein lo hefsid shaharei chavero mevakesh mimenu umavticham l'shalem lo. He says this is a form of hashavas aveda. And that's why this case is discussed in Bava Metzia, which talks about the mitzvah of returning lost objects, right? The barrel of, or the container of honey is like a lost object. It's about to be lost. I have an opportunity to save my friend's asset, even though it may cost me a little bit of money, but I'll get compensated for that on the back end. So that's no different from Hashava Saveda, where I find my friend's animal and it's going to cost me a little bit of money to put up signs and to give the animal dog food and whatever it is, but I'm obligated to return his dog to him, even though it's going to cost me a little bit of money. I'm allowed to charge him for whatever my costs were, whatever my expenses were, but it's still a mitzvah of Hashava Saveda. So that's why in this kind of situation, a person can take liberty and say that since you have the mitzvah of Hashava Saveda, you, the wine owner, have a mitzvah of Hashava Saveda, I'm allowed to utilize your container, even though you're going to incur a small loss. Zehu Tanai Mitanaim Shehisna Yehoshua. This is one of the conditions that Yehoshua made when the Jews inherited Eretz Yisrael. Ve'im niskalkel opach samach mas malacha yesh omrim depater. Now, according to this, if the object became damaged or reduced in value, I borrow your tool and I damage it in some way, some say that I'm putter from paying you the kevin to Tanai Beistenu v'das Rachmana Ika Avi Kesocher Midas the putter b'meisa machmas malacha. He says there's an opinion that says that let's say I borrow your tool, and in the course of borrowing your tool, it cracks or it gets damaged in some way. It chips or something like that. So there is an opinion that says that that's like Mesa Machmas Malacha. That just like if I am renting an object from you and it dies in the course of use, I'm putter from paying you. So similar or a shoel, if I borrow it from you and it's Mesa Machmas Malacha in the course of doing normal usage of the object or the animal, then I'm putter from paying you. Avalanias daiti lo nihira. Ein la'el sifhei bi'urim, sof divrei amaschel shelo Yaakov. But he says that to me is not clear. It seems to me that in that kind of situation, you are going to have to pay for the use for whatever loss. Okay. So that's, I don't think we saw this biurim, but that's okay. Just see. There was this long piece of Shoel Shalomi Das Haba'olim. Okay, maybe we'll do that piece afterwards. Okay. Okay. There are opinions that disagree with this. Some argue when the wine owner is present and the guy with the cracked container of honey says to him, really the halacha says that you have to spill out your wine. Please, can I have your container? That some say that the wine owner says, I prefer to keep my wine if that's all the same. Umikol makom hoel haosek b'malachto v'yesh lefanav hashava saveda. So, but let's talk about a similar situation. You've got a fellow who's working on the job. Okay, he's a paid employee of a company, and all of a sudden, someone comes to him and says, "Hey, you got to help me. My factory next door is on fire. I need you to come and help me put out the fire." Okay. And the owner of the warehouse that's on fire says to the employee says, "I can't help you. I'm working." So the guy whose house is on fire says, "I'll pay you whatever your hourly wage is. Just help me save my loss." He says, then you're obligated in that situation to help him. So the question is, why is that different from a guy who says, "I'd rather keep my wine"? No, thank you. If someone else's property is being destroyed and I can save them, and I know that I'll be compensated for whatever loss I incur, Why is it any different from the halacha where I have to help put out someone's fire as long as I know that he'll compensate me for my lost work? Why? What's the difference between the two? That's his question. The shiny hacha diyachol lihitnatzil v'lomer nichali b'yayin shali. He says, because a person always has a way of explaining. He says, my wine is more valuable to me than your honey is valuable to you. And that's the argument that, according to this opinion, he's allowed to use. Whereas perhaps on the open market, the honey is more valuable than the wine, but it's a personal effect of mine, whatever sentimental value, whatever the guy's going to argue. And according to this opinion, he's allowed to, excuse me, he's allowed to refuse to spill out his wine according to this second opinion. Okay, and so this is the machlokes, I guess, between the two opinions. Does a person have a right to refuse, or does he not have a right to refuse? And so if he's present, but if he's not present, a person is allowed to assume and is allowed to take the wine, the wine container, and spill out the wine. And he says the opinion of those who disagree. He says, Das hasma sof simin shin yud ches, or sof simin shin ches, rather. The gam hacholkim lo pligye ella al hadisfir le ledea rishona de bal hayayin chayev lishpoch yeno im bal hadvash mevakshehu. He says this opinion that disagrees is only when the wine owner is present. Does he have a right to refuse to spill out his wine or not? According to the first opinion, he doesn't have a right to refuse the request to spill out his wine. According to the second opinion, he does have a right to refuse. But he says, but if the wine owner is not present and I happen to find a container of wine that I know belongs to someone, then efshar de l'kuli alma mutter lebal hadvash lishpoch yenu shel chavero al menas l'shalim lo. Then everyone would agree that the owner of the honey who's about to lose his investment is allowed to spill out the wine, since we have no indication that the person would not want that. Achein harav kan b'kuntras achron nishar lov b'tzarachiyun the mistimas harifa haramba mashma the b'chol gavne gamin balayayin eno kan spirle da asr lo lishpoch yenu. But the Rav Shulchan Aruch, in what's called the Kuntras Achron, which is where he made addenda and notes to his original psak, and it's here, it's printed in this Rashi script over here, as you can see. He says, Ayin Sham Gabe Devorim, the Mistimas HaMishnah V'Rif Rambam, Mashma Av She'en Chaver Sham Lo Yakutz, the Lo Kisma B'Tzarech Iyun. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch writes, he says, it seems from the language of the Rif and the Rambam that you don't have a right to spill out your friend's wine when you're dealing with this case, even if the guy is not present. And so he says v'tzarchian. And so it's a bit of a conundrum because there seems to be some ambiguity about this halacha. So how should you comport yourself? So if you're the wine owner, then you should spill out your wine if you're a God-fearing Jew. Even though there's a second opinion that says that you have a right to refuse, but if you're a God-fearing person, recognizes that there's one side of the halacha that requires you to spill out your wine to help save your friend's more valuable asset, then you should go according to that opinion. And like that's what we learned previously. And so lachush l'svara achrona. But you should also worry about the second opinion if you're the honey owner. Wrote Salomer debal hadvash tzarich lachush l'svara hashniya. The svirle deleka bazet tonight Yeshua ben Nun, who holds that we don't give you an automatic right to save your asset by destroying your friend's asset. וממילא אסור לו להציל שלו בקלקול חפציו של חברו, אלא אם כן ידוע לו שלא יכביד עליו חברו. And therefore, you should not spill out your friend's wine unless you know the guy and you know him to be an amiable person who will not be upset when he finds out that you destroyed his asset, because you're willing to pay him, and he'll be okay with it because he's not so attached to his possessions. Okay, so this is all. So the bottom line is that we're really left with a very open machlokes between two different opinions. Do I have a right automatically to save my more valuable asset by destroying my friend's asset, or do I not have the right to do that unless I know that he won't mind and that I'll pay him because I'm going to pay him afterwards? On the opposite side, looking at both parties, the party whose asset is about to be damaged, it's not clear whether I have an automatic right or I have to know who the person is and that he's not going to mind. And on the opposite side, I, who am the owner of the less valuable asset, if I'm present, do I have an obligation to relinquish my property to help save the guy's more valuable property, right? Or can I refuse? Or do I have a right of refusal? And a God-fearing Jew should be ready to relinquish his property as long as you know that you'll be compensated for it. But if you know the guy's not going to compensate you for it, I've got to commandeer your vehicle, right? Because I'm on a high-speed car chase, right? And you know that you probably will never see the guy again. So then you're not obligated to do that under any conditions, right? So anyway. In a split second, sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the halacha that let me just see what was the divrei hamaschal that we were looking at, shelo yakbid alav. So I want to take a look at that tomorrow. We'll just backtrack a little bit, because that halacha in Sifhei was talking about you're not allowed to borrow someone else's property unless you know for sure that he's not going to mind. Okay? And so we'll take a look at that. That's a couple of pages ago, because he deals with the question of the nifchesav and his kalkala machmas malacha. What happens if I borrow someone's property that I know for sure he doesn't mind if I borrow it, and it gets damaged in the course of my borrowing it? So we'll take a look at that halacha Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay? Have a great day, everybody.